Welcome. In this video, I'm continuing my discussion of academic writing. I'll be addressing the organization of the arguments within the paper. In the first video of this series, I addressed audience and audience analysis, to whom are the thesis and the arguments presented. In the second video, I addressed the purpose, not just the obvious external purpose of earning a high grade for one's work, but the function of why are the thesis and the arguments presented to the audience? What is it that you seek to persuade the audience to accept? Now, in this video, I'm going to address organization of arguments. Arguments can be organized in myriad ways: chronologically, topically, by length, maybe from shortest data sets to longest data sets, or the reverse. The order in which the arguments are presented is not as important as ensuring that the arguments are presented in a logical manner and that a cohesive complement of arguments are presented in the student paper. Here I've returned to the Microsoft Word document that I had been using in prior videos, and I've created a new section that I titled Organization of Arguments. Now, before I get into the specific topic of organization, I'd like to make a more general comment. I think that each student who submits a paper in response to an assignment should receive two things. One, specific feedback on what they did well in their paper and how they can improve their work. And two, some type of notation of evaluation. Maybe it's an earned grade, maybe it's a check mark to indicate that the assignment has been completed, but in some way, feedback that helps the student know that they have met a course obligation, and specific guidance on how to improve the quality of their work in future papers. I think it's reasonable that each student who submits a paper in response to an assignment can expect two things in return. One, specific feedback that guides them to improving the quality of their work and recognizes those elements of the submission that were done very well. And two, some type of an evaluation, either a grade or a check mark indicating completion of a requirement. In either regard, both of these, the feedback and the evaluation, are vital to a student's succeeding in a course that requires written papers. As part of the feedback, either the instructor or the evaluator, often it's the same person, offers comments about the quality of the student work, possibly about the specific learning objectives stated in the course or the assignment objectives, such as there'll be a focus on topic and appropriate use of standard grammar, organization of arguments. But the real purpose of this feedback is to help the student to understand how to write well for a particular audience. Yes, many faculty focus on ensuring that students are aware of, and in some cases have memorized, particular facts. But I think when pressed, all of my colleagues would agree with me that our primary goal is not to require students to memorize facts, but to demonstrate an ability to communicate effectively within a particular discipline and generally across disciplines. One of the problems that comes up for students is that they don't often recognize that readers of their work will have a particular response, and that they may not take into account how their work will be understood, how their work will be perceived by the audience to whom they are addressing their arguments. And that's why the first video in this series was so important. It's the audience needs to be identified, and then the writer, the student, prepares work to meet the needs of the audience, and the student should remember while writing for whom they are writing and how is that audience likely to respond to the arguments as they are presented in the paper. I think the principal means of preparing cogent, understandable, persuasive arguments is to ensure that they serve one another, that the paper itself is cohesive. It fits to all the disparate components fit together into an integrated whole. This cohesiveness is very important. And I'm thinking to myself of an example of lack of cohesiveness. I recently guided a student writing a paper on a technical topic, and in the course of writing the paper, like 1 or 2 pages into the paper, the student started including other facts. The facts were accurately presented, the sources of the data were properly cited, but the facts had no weight, had no topical relationship to the general thesis of the paper. Were the facts interesting? Yeah, but they were an aside to the primary thesis of the paper. And therefore, I had to judge that the paper was not cohesive. It included material that didn't serve the persuasive needs of the assignment itself. So in creating this unified whole, this cohesive paper, requires addressing both implicit and explicit links that can exist between and among the arguments that are presented. I say between and among because as an American, I make the distinction between those two words. Between is connecting 2 elements, among is connecting 3 or more elements. And I understand that speakers of other versions of English sometimes don't make that distinction between and among. In any regard, these arguments that are presented, when cohesive, serve to build on and support one another. It's as if they were bricks held together with mortar rather than just loose bricks that are laying about the worksite. And ultimately, all of the arguments, although cohesive among themselves, serve to support the thesis, the principal claim presented in the introduction and usually reiterated in the conclusion of an academic paper. I've been able to identify 2 introductory levels of coherence: propositional coherence and interactional coherence. Propositional coherence seeks to find the implicit links that exist among the arguments when the arguments are written well by the student writer. When the reader of the work is able to observe these links between and among the arguments, the reader is more likely to judge the paper to be coherent. And coherence is not something that one usually recognizes when it exists, but we recognize it when it doesn't exist. When a paper goes off topic and onto a tangent and may or may not return to the primary thesis presented at the beginning of the paper. And the audience will use its knowledge and hopefully recognize its biases or biases related to the arguments that are presented in the paper, and seek to observe for themselves how the arguments are fitting together. And this is a natural process that occurs during reading and listening to speeches, that we seek to follow the thread of the argumentation. And when that thread's broken, or there's an interjection made, or a left turn made and the topic changes, we find that disconcerting. Now, in humor, that can be very funny, but we don't expect most academic papers to serve the purpose of humor. Interactional coherence, a complement to propositional coherence, occurs through the form of the arguments. For example, does each argument have a historical basis? Are the arguments presented in chronological order? Are the arguments presented in thematic order? It's this form of the argument presentation that's called interactional coherence. And the function of the form of the arguments is not what is said, but how it is said, or in what order it is said or written. And it's more aligned with, for example, the formatting of the document or the order in which the arguments are presented. But both the propositional coherence, which is the actual content of the arguments, are each of the arguments somehow related to one another by content, or are they related by form? That's the interactional coherence. Both elements are important to making a persuasive complement of arguments. I hope this introduction to the organization of arguments is helpful to you. There are many ways in which arguments can be ordered, but are they presented in a way that shows that they are organized, that they belong together, and that they serve the thesis of the paper? I found that, to the best of my recollection, all student papers that I've read have been persuasive to one degree or another. Whether I told the students to write a persuasive paper or not, the students are still presenting a thesis and attempting to persuade me to accept the thesis and maybe even the subordinate claims that they present in their work. And in seeking to be persuasive, it's important to consider how the arguments will be received by the audience. What are the audience's expectations? What does the audience already know about the topic? And are the arguments presented in a manner, including in an order, a sequential order, that best serves the persuasive needs of the paper? So I'm going to leave it at this. And I wish you the very best of academic writing. Bye for now.